So related to the nodes, can you explain again how the dignity impacts, how the dignity of the Lord and the dignity of Saturn and Mars are going to impact how the nodes work? All right. I'll do my best to answer this with the time that we have. I do feel that we spent a lot of time in the Rahu and Ketu course going over this. So if you haven't quite got it yet, I would start over with the Rahu and Ketu course and go through that one more time. But let's talk about it. Okay. So when we're looking at Rahu and Ketu, they are sensitive points within the chart, as Fiona had mentioned early on. They represent how they represent the relationship between the sun and the moon to the ecliptic and where these things kind of cross. Let's see if there's a image here I can show you about that. Okay, not super clear, but what you can see with the nodes of the moon is we have the Earth here in the middle, and we have the sun. We have the Earth's shadow, so the sun is going to shine on the Earth, and it's going to create a shadow over here. Now, we also have the movement of the moon. So we've got the Earth here, the sun. Now, I know the sun doesn't go around the Earth, but just for our purposes, it seems like the sun is going around the Earth, the solar path. The moon does go around the Earth, so we have a lunar path as well. And what you can see here is that there are these two elliptical patterns. And K2 shows up when the moon crosses over the path of the sun and it's going below the sun. You see, the south lunar node, it's going down. That's how we get K2. So it's a mathematical point where this is going to occur. Now, as the moon goes around, remember the moon moves very quickly, it's also going to come back up and it's going to cross over the path of the sun. So as the moon comes back up and crosses over this path of the sun, that point where it happens and it's going northward, I guess relatively speaking, that's where you're going to get Rahu, or the north lunar node. And you're going to start to get the eclipses occur when these points line up with where the shadow is cast. All right, that's when an eclipse occurs. So eclipses aren't necessarily just Rahu and Ketu. That just happens to be a very, that's just the point where the path of the sun and the moon cross, where it lines up with this Earth shadow. So that's the astronomy, in a way, of Rahu and Ketu, very briefly in a nutshell. Now, wherever Rahu and Ketu is placed within the chart, they may act positively, they may act negatively. They're always going to act in some way which is disruptive, just like the invention of the car, the invention of the automobile. All right. Well, that was a very good thing in some ways, aside from all the pollution. But that was a very good thing for humanity at some point in time. That was a new thing. That was a Rahu-like thing. It was disruptive, though. What happened to all those people, farriers, who were going to shoe the horses? What happened to all the people who stabled the horses? What was going to happen to their jobs with this new vehicle? So it was positive, but it was disruptive. This is kind of how Rahu works. Let's look at renewable energy, wind and solar. Well, that's a Rahu thing. It's disruptive. How are all the coal miners going to have jobs? How are we going to sustain all these gasoline stations, petrol stations, if all of a sudden now we're using solar and wind energy? It's disruptive. It's going to cause problems, but it's a positive kind of disruption. That's kind of like Rahu. So the nodes they're always disruptive, but are they going to be disruptive in a negative way, or are they going to be disruptive in a positive way? So if you have, for example, like in the chart we just looked at, K2, and when we think about K2's Lord, Venus, one thing we do know is that K2's Lord, Venus, is in a very positive, a delighted Avashta. throughout almost all of the Vargas, which means that that Ketu is going to tend to work better long term because the Lord of Ketu has a lot of support from Mercury. Also in that chart, let's see, the dignity, I think it's in a friend sign. Yeah. So we have the Lord in a friend sign, which is a good sign, which means, again, the disruption, the difficulties that Ketu causes are going to be positive. I don't remember where Mars was. Where was Mars? So Mars, oh, Mars is exalted. All right. So Mars is exalted in that chart. And what does that mean? Well, that means that Ketu's energy is also going to act in an exalted fashion. So Ketu, even though it's contributing to an ashamed Avashta and so on, there actually is a lot of positivity towards Ketu. And that's where you get someone's life who there might be disruptions, there might be difficulties, but the end result of those disruptions tend to give a person a better situation. So that's how the nodes can work. And when the nodes, let's say it's complete opposite, let's say that the Lord of Ketu was debilitated or even just in an enemy sign, and that the Lord of the node was starved or was ashamed or was agitated. Well, that's going to make the disruption of Ketu difficult, but it's also going to make the person feel like, I don't really know if this is worth it. It's not going to tend to result in a material experience that's going to make them feel like, oh, okay, well, that worked out. So when we look at the nodes of the moon, again, this is why in the Asheville Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship Program, which you're participating in, you don't just look at Rahu and Ketu and make a blanket statement. You have to understand what planets rule Rahu and Ketu. You have to understand everything about the planet that rules Rahu and Ketu, the Avashtas, the Shadbala, the house that it's in. All of that is going to color what Rahu and Ketu is up to. Then you can also look at, Mars is related to Ketu and Saturn is related to Rahu. You look at what that planet is up to. So you can get some very, 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 very general, good information the way most astrologers do, just saying Ketu's in this sign, Ketu's with this planet, so therefore it means that. But you can get very specific information. You can get very specific information when you know how to analyze the entirety of Rahu and Ketu's ruler and then synthesize it with the access point, 1, 7, or 2, 8, and so on, or 4 and 10. You can synthesize it with that throughout the chart. Then you get very precise information about how Rahu and Ketu is going to work. And you will be able to say things such as, yes, this Rahu Dasha is going to totally wreck your situation, because you see all of the indications for Rahu are really difficult. Or you might see someone going into a Rahu cycle, and everyone's afraid of the Rahu cycle, but Rahu, its Lord, and Saturn are doing very well, so you can make more positive predictions about it. And this is also helpful because if there is a lot of negativity around the nodes, well, then you can help to find ways to bring more consciousness to that area so the person will be better prepared, have more resilience, a greater capacity to understand what's going on so they don't make things worse. That's an important thing. In astrology, and in all areas of life, oftentimes it's not what happens, it's our response to what happens that determines if things actually get better or worse, because no one's chart has to be an absolute train wreck. You can say that, but if you're a good astrologer, then you can figure out ways to bring more awareness to them so that you can prepare them for where they are. If someone's born in a desert with no water and no food, then you're not going to sugarcoat it. You're going to say, well, you need to get out of the desert or you need to figure out a way to divine water, get some divining rods out. And that's the way that you can be helpful as an astrologer, even if Rahu and Ketu dashas or the situations of Rahu and Ketu aren't so good, because we all have things that aren't so good in our life. And it's just part of the human experience. I don't care who you are, unless you're completely oblivious, which may be a good thing, I suppose, sometimes. Anyway, so to answer your question, when you're looking at Rahu and Ketu, you definitely need to go back and review the entirety of the course on Rahu and Ketu, because we spent a lot of time looking at these specifics in the Asheville Vedic Astrology Apprenticeship Program. But if you know how to assess the planets that rule over Rahu and Ketu, that will go a long way to give you a complete picture of what Rahu and Ketu are actually going to do.